In October of 2000, a small village in England was desperately searching for 5 missing members of their community. Leslie Ford and 4 of her 6 children had suddenly vanished and no one had heard from them in weeks. Many people close to the situation knew right away that something sinister was at play here. Leslie and her kids had been living a nightmare for years, and it seemed like their worst fears may have finally come true. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Summer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime cults and heinous history. And today we're talking about Lee Ford, one of the worst step-parents you can possibly imagine. And this case is truly heartbreaking, and we're going to get into all of that right after we briefly talk about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Raycon. Father's Day is fast approaching, and a lot of us are racking our brains trying to figure out the perfect gift. Well, this Father's Day, you can treat the dad in your life to a pair of everyday earbuds by Raycon. This would be the perfect gift for any dad who likes to listen to music or podcast while they're working out at the gym or working around the house. Dad's gonna get high quality sound and you will get them at an amazing price. These earbuds have a really great battery life. They can last up to 32 hours and they have a quick charge function. So just 10 minutes of charging will give you 90 minutes of battery life. They're also dust proof and sweat and water resistant. So no need to worry if you accidentally drop them in a puddle or if you send them through the washing machine. And they're really comfortable in the ear, which is really important to me. I've had issues with other earbuds not staying in my ear while I'm running, but I have not had that issue with my Raycons. They fit perfectly snug and they stay put in my ear. I've even fallen asleep with these in my ears on multiple occasions and I've woken up with them still in place. The everyday earbuds are offered in a variety of vibrant colors as well, so you could get dad a pair in his favorite color. And they also have these protective cases that come in a variety of designs. I have the one in blue water and I really like the way this one looks. And not only do these cases look nice and provide great protection, but they also support wireless charging, so you don't have to take the cover off in order to charge them. I use these earbuds all the time. I use them while I'm exercising, when I'm listening to podcasts while I work around the house, but I use them most while I'm working. From listening to countless audiobooks for my research to spending hours upon hours editing my videos, these earbuds are essential to my day-to-day life. And I love the active noise cancellation function. I live in a full house, I have lots of dogs, lots of kids, and I work from home. So having earbuds that help to drown out all the background noise is a must for me. But the best thing about Raycon everyday earbuds is the price point. They sound just as good, if not better, than other leading earbuds on the market, but they're half the price. So give the dad in your life the gift of premium sound this year by going to buyraycon.com/summersanchez or clicking the link in the description box to get 15% off site-wide. And if for some reason he doesn't like his Raycons, they offer a 30-day happiness guarantee return policy, no questions asked. Again, that's buyraycon.com/summersanchez to get up to 15% off site-wide. And using that link does help to support this channel. A big thank you to Raycon for sponsoring this video, and now let's get into the case. It's October 2000 and Peter Wyatt has just received a phone call from his uncle that would completely turn his life upside down. Peter's 36-year-old sister Leslie Ford, along with her 4 oldest children, haven't been seen in weeks, and his uncle was calling to ask if Peter had heard from them recently. Peter and Leslie were usually very close, but they had gotten into an argument a few months back and they hadn't spoken since. So Peter gets off the phone with his uncle and he is completely shaken. Leslie had been having a lot of very disturbing issues with her husband lately, and Peter knew that his sister and her kids could be in serious danger. And so he decides to give his brother-in-law a call just to ask what's going on. You know, like, why are we just now learning that Leslie and the kids have been missing for an entire month? And his brother-in-law's response was just bizarre. He immediately starts accusing Peter of hiding Leslie and the kids at his house. He says, "We had a big fight. She took the 4 oldest kids and she left. Someone picked her up and they just drove away. And I know that they are with you." Now, of course, Leslie was not with Peter, and he's just saying, like, "No, she's not with me. I have not seen her in months." But that's all he really got from that phone call. No leads, no real information. And so when he got off that call with his brother-in-law, he knew that something was very, very wrong. His sister had confided in him about some very dark family secrets involving her husband, and Peter knew that he could not be trusted. Not only that, but in addition to the 4 kids who were missing, his sister also had 2 younger children. If Leslie had just up and left, why would she have only taken the 4 oldest kids? He knew that Leslie would have never left any of her children behind. After he hangs up the phone, Peter starts searching for his sister and her kids. So Leslie Wyatt was born in 1964 in the small town of Fordingbridge, Hampshire in England, and I couldn't find out many details about her early life, but I do know that she was the oldest of 3 kids. She had a brother, which was Peter, and a younger sister, and Leslie was described as just a really loving, caring person. She was extremely thoughtful. She always put the needs of others before herself. Peter has said that Leslie would take care of him and protect him, and she was very motherly towards him, and they were very close. And they would remain close into their adulthood. That is until a evil human being comes into the picture later on. Then when Leslie is 11 years old, her family moved from Fordingbridge in Hampshire to a town 3 hours drive north called Telford in Shropshire. The family settled into this new life in Telford, and there's nothing really to report for the next 5 years. And then when Leslie is 16 years old, she meets a guy who would become her first husband. His name was Michael Tranter, and he worked in the Telford bus depot, and he would see Leslie at the station on her way to work at a care home. They started talking one day, one thing led to another, and they started dating. And they quickly realized that they wanted the same things out of life. They both wanted to get married and have lots of children. They just kind of clicked, everything just kind of fell into place, and it wasn't long into their relationship before Michael asked Leslie to marry him, and she said yes. They moved to Leslie's hometown in Hampshire, and they started a life there. When Leslie was around 19 years old, she and Michael welcomed their first child. It was a daughter they named Sarah Jane. Then just 1 year later, they welcomed another daughter named Anne Marie. 2 years after that, they had their first son, Stephen Paul. And then just a year later, they welcomed their fourth and final child, who they named Craig Jonathan. By 1987, Leslie and Michael's family was complete. And by all accounts, they seemed like they had a really great relationship. They got along really well, and their family and friends have said that they seemed like this very loving, perfect, happy couple. But eventually, Leslie and Michael started having some marital problems. I'm not really sure what was going on. Maybe just the stress of being a young couple with 4 very young children might have put a strain on the relationship. But after the youngest child, Craig Jonathan, was born, they made the decision to move back to Telford, just, I guess, thinking that a change of scenery and being closer to some of their family members might help the situation. But by 1989, after 8 years of marriage, Leslie and Michael decided to call it quits. As far as I could tell from the research, there was no infidelity or any major issues. They just weren't in love anymore. The divorce was extremely amicable. The children lived with Leslie, but Michael saw them all the time. He would come over for dinner and for tea and just for visits with the kids. He would often pick the kids up to spend time at his place, or he would take them out somewhere. Michael and Leslie had a very natural, very healthy transition from husband and wife to just good friends. Michael has even said that after their divorce, he and Leslie still remained best friends. And this was really good for the children. They didn't have to deal with that animosity that can sometimes build up between divorced couples. Even though their mom and dad were no longer together romantically, they still obviously really cared for one another. And this made it extremely easy to co-parent the children. They were still working as a team. But all of this was about to change because Leslie was about to meet a really sick human being named Lee Ford. And Leslie's entire life and the lives of her children and her ex-husband Michael were about to be turned upside down. So Lee Ford was born in 1967, and he grew up in Telford, Shropshire, in the market town of Wellington. And that is literally all we know about Lee's early life. Unfortunately, I could not find any trace of information about his childhood. But we do know that by the time Lee was in his early 20s, he was just sort of wandering aimlessly through life. He was working odd jobs in construction, like painting houses and roofing houses, but he never really held down a job for very long. And because of this, he didn't really have much money. And what little money he did have mostly went towards buying alcohol because Lee was a very, very heavy drinker. And this is Lee's life. He worked when he felt like it and he drank. That's basically all he did. But what Lee lacked in financial stability and motivation, he allegedly made up for with his charm. It's been said that Lee was somewhat of a ladies' man and he always knew the right things to say. And when he happened to cross paths with Leslie in 1990, unfortunately, they really hit it off and they started dating. And they got close very, very fast. This was a whirlwind romance situation. Things are happening very quickly. He is coming over to the house all the time. He is meeting the children. And Lee was a few years younger than Leslie as well. So I think that this might have been flattering to her that this younger person was interested in her. Now, Leslie's family, when they first met Lee, they were a little taken aback by his appearance. They just didn't think that he looked like someone that Leslie would be with. Lee was very rough around the edges. He was scruffy, had long hair. Where Leslie dressed really well, she was put together, she was attractive. And aside from the physical differences, there was just something about Lee that just didn't sit right with Leslie's family. They couldn't really put their finger on it at first, but they just felt like something was off, which they were 100% right. There was definitely something off about Lee. In the beginning, Lee was trying his hardest to play the role of the perfect attentive boyfriend. He is being super charming. He is saying all the right things. He's being really great to Leslie's 4 young children. He's totally love bombing her, telling her all the things that she would want to hear. He would have been filling Leslie's head full of idealistic scenarios of them getting married and him being this like really great stepdad and them just having this great life together. And you will see that that could not be farther from the truth. But sadly, Lee's love bombing worked, and after just a few months of dating, Leslie and Lee got married. And now in Lee's mind, Leslie belongs to him, and he is in complete control of not only her, but also her 4 children. And Lee started to reveal himself for the monster that he was. First of all, he was an insanely jealous person. He wanted Leslie all to himself. He did not want her talking to anyone else, especially other men. And as it usually goes with insanely jealous partners, Lee was also extremely controlling. He started controlling basically every aspect of Leslie's life. He told her how to dress. She had to wear makeup the way that he wanted her to wear makeup. She was not allowed to just be herself. Now that he was the man of the house, Lee felt like he now had the final say on literally everything, even everything pertaining to the children, including when they got to see their actual father, Michael Tranter. Like I said, Michael and Leslie had always had this really amazing co-parenting relationship, and Lee was not about to let that continue. He wanted to cut Michael completely out of the picture. He wanted to step in and take over as husband and father unconditionally, not the stepfather, just the father. And so Lee slowly started to drive a wedge between Michael and Leslie and Michael and the kids. It started with Lee intercepting phone calls from Michael to the kids. Then when Michael would show up at Leslie's to pick up the kids for his scheduled time, Lee would come to the door and he would make up any excuse he could as to why the kids were not allowed to go. They weren't ready yet, come back in a couple of hours. And then when Michael would come back, he would say, they're still not ready, try again tomorrow. Sometimes he would just flat out tell Michael that the kids didn't want to see him, which was not true.
I was going around to pick up the children. Didn't take long before he would come on the scene saying, they're not ready, they're not dressed, come back in an hour. And then I was told that, no, they don't want to see me. I asked to speak to Leslie, and I was told that she didn't want to speak to me.
And Leslie was being so controlled and manipulated at this point, she just kind of let this happen. And Michael still continued calling. He still continued stopping by the house to see the kids, but most of the time Lee would interfere. And Michael, of course, was heartbroken because this random man has just come in and taken control of his family, and he felt powerless to stop it. He tried to tell Leslie what was going on, but Leslie wouldn't talk to him anymore. They went from being best friends to basically having no relationship at all. And what Michael didn't know is that things had turned physically violent in the home. We don't know the extent of the abuse, but Lee would physically abuse Leslie and the children, especially when he drank, which was pretty much all the time. You take an already controlling and abusive person and you add excessive amounts of alcohol into the mix, and it's going to have devastating consequences. Leslie and the children were living a nightmare, day in and day out. It would get so bad that Leslie would have to call her brother Peter to come help her with Lee. Peter would go over to her house, he would kick Lee out, and this happened on multiple occasions, but it never failed. Just a few days later, Lee would just move right back in. It was the vicious cycle that we see all the time in these abusive relationships. And the situation got even worse when Leslie gave birth to her first child with Lee. And now that he has a child with Leslie, he feels like he truly has full control over her. Now he can hold that child over her head to keep her there. And so things just continue like this for the next 5 years. Lee is a total tyrant. He's cruel. He's controlling to everyone in that house, especially Leslie. Michael Tranter is still trying to see his children, but he is being blocked constantly by Lee. And I didn't read anything about Michael going through the courts to try to get access to his children. So I don't know if he tried the legal route or not, but either way, he has gone from seeing his children all the time and being a very positive, loving, caring presence in their lives to now hardly ever seeing them. Michael did not know what to do about the situation. He felt completely powerless. And after dealing with Lee's abuse day in and day out for 5 years and not really seeing any end in sight, Leslie suddenly realizes that she needs to get out of this situation situation, and she decides that she is going to leave. So one day in 1995, Leslie packs up her 5 children and she moves 300 miles south to Cornwall. Now, Leslie had to be very careful leading up to this move. She really did not want Lee to find her, and so she told very few people where she was going. And I think that this shows just how desperate Leslie was to escape the situation. Like I said, we don't have a lot of specific details about the abuse that was taking place in the home, but the fact that Leslie has literally gone into hiding in order to escape Lee says a lot. Leslie and the kids ended up settling in a caravan in Cornwall, and they started trying to put their lives back together, and just find some peace now that they were finally away from Lee. This was the longest stretch that Leslie had ever been apart from Lee, and she was holding strong. She was doing really well. Meanwhile, back in Telford, Michael Tranter has no clue where his family is gone. They've just disappeared. Leslie didn't tell Michael where she was going or that she was even leaving at all. So one day, Michael just showed up at Leslie's house to see the children, and he knocks on the door. There's no answer. He knocks again, still no answer. And one of the neighbors sees Michael standing on the doorstep, knocking on the door, and they walk over to Michael and they say, "Hey, if you're looking for Leslie and the kids, they're not there. They moved out." That is how Michael found out that his children were gone. And he was extremely confused and scared, honestly, because he didn't know if his family was safe. And as you can imagine, knowing Lee, knowing how controlling and violent he is, you can imagine how he was frantically searching all over the place for Leslie, and he wasn't having any luck. Leslie had done a really good job covering her tracks. And a few months go by and Lee still has heard nothing from Leslie. And then one day he hatched a plan. If there was one person who would know where Leslie was, it was her mother, Margaret. So he calls Margaret and he pretends to be a solicitor, and he tells her that he's been trying to contact her daughter, Leslie, but he hasn't been able to track her down, and he needs to know her address. Lee had been right. Margaret was one of the few people who knew Leslie's whereabouts, and so she ended up falling for Lee's trick. And just like that, Leslie and the children's peaceful new life in Cornwall was over. Lee showed up at Leslie's house and he immediately started trying to win her back. He is telling her things will be different. He'll change. And this is heartbreaking, but when Leslie's oldest daughter, Sarah Jane, realized what was going on and she knew what was inevitably going to happen, that Lee was going to worm his way back into their lives, she contacted her grandmother and she started begging her not to let Lee come back into their lives. She desperately wanted someone to save them from Lee. And when you learn the depths of Lee's depravity later on in the case, Sarah Jane's cry for help becomes even more devastating. And Lee's sweet talk and empty promises worked, and Leslie took him back. They ended up moving to a little village called Bugle, and they just picked right back up where they left off. Lee, of course, did not keep any of his promises. He was not trying to get any better. He was still abusing Leslie and the children. This was a vicious cycle that just continued. And in 1997, Leslie found out she was pregnant with baby number 6, her second child with Lee. And I think that with each new child that they have, Lee just feels more and more like Leslie is his possession. He gains even more control over her and the children. If Leslie ever wanted to go visit her family back in Hampshire, Lee would refuse to let the kids go with her. And if he did let any of the kids go, he would only let 1 or 2 of them go. This was his way of making sure that Leslie returned home from those trips.
She wasn't allowed to come and stay with the kids on her own. Or if she did, it would only be a couple of the kids, if anything. But there would always be some left with Lee. So it was a control thing again. It was a bargaining point to make sure that Leslie now would go back.
He knew that Leslie was not going to leave her children behind, and that if he had them, she would always come back. So Lee did allow the kids to go to public school, and they were even allowed to play sports. I know the 2 boys, Stephen and Craig, played football. And I did find that odd because when you hear cases like this where you have this extremely controlling situation within a family, they are usually homeschooled, to keep outsiders from asking questions. But in this case, I really think that Lee wanted to do the bare minimum to keep suspicions at bay, like sending them to school, allowing them to play sports. Those are activities that are very ordinary to most children. The 4 oldest kids from the outside would appear to be like typical kids because they were allowed to go to school and they were allowed to play sports. But in reality, those kids are actually living anything but a typical life. And school and sports were pretty much the only things that they were allowed to do. They were not allowed to have a social life. They couldn't go hang out at friends' houses or go to social functions. Friends were not allowed at their house either. Lee basically kept them in isolation. Sarah Jane was a pretty quiet kid. She was very sweet and she did make some friends at school. She never came out and told them anything like specifically was happening at home, but there were signs that in hindsight, her friends can now see that they had missed before. Like there were times when Lee would show up to pick Sarah Jane up from school and her friends would notice that she would visibly be scared and she did not want to get into the car with Lee. There was also another time at school where the teacher assigned the class a project where they had to talk about their families, and Sarah Jane told her friend that she didn't want to participate in this particular project, and then she ran out of the classroom crying. One of Anne-Marie's school friends later said that she never wanted to get dressed for PE, like her gym class. She didn't want to change into the gym clothes. She was always covered up completely. Her arms, her legs, everything was always covered. It's now thought that she was trying to hide bruises. And as the kids got older, especially the girls, Lee became much more watchful over them, like in a creepy way. He was always lurking around, making sure that they didn't have any close relationships with boys and keeping a close eye on the relationships that they had with girls too. And for some reason, just 1 year after arriving in Bugle, Lee decided that the family needed to move again. This time they landed in the village of Carnkai. It's thought that Lee chose Carnkai because of how remote it is. It's a very small village, less people to pry into their business, less risk of someone finding out what a monster he actually was. And this is sadly where Lee Ford would commit an absolutely horrific act of violence and wipe out nearly his entire family. So it is now the year 2000, and at this point, Sarah Jane is 17 years old, Anne-Marie is 16, Stephen is 14, and Craig is 13. And they have settled into this new life in Carnkai. Like I said, this is a small village and everyone knows everyone, but no one really knew this family. They were pretty closed off from the rest of the community. Leslie is hardly ever seen out in public at all at this point, and if anyone ever did see her, it was usually just while she was in her own front yard. And people who did have interactions with Leslie have said that she was very sweet. Like, she was always a very pleasant person to talk to. And what the community didn't know, but what we know, is that Lee was keeping her there. She was completely under his control. And the kids were really only going out when they had to. The physical abuse is escalating. Lee is still drinking a lot, and he's now occasionally doing drugs as well, which is making the violence even worse. And then just when you think things can't get any worse, they do. Because in the summer of 2000, Leslie discovered that Lee was sexually abusing her oldest daughter, Sarah Jane. She had actually walked in on Lee doing something inappropriate to Sarah Jane. We don't have the details of what exactly happened. Leslie, likely being too scared to call the police for fear of what Lee might do to her, she instead calls her brother Peter, and she told him what she'd found out. And Peter wasted no time. He just flew into action, and he headed down to Carnkai to Leslie's house to confront Lee and to get him away from his sister and his nieces and nephews once and for all. This was it. This was the breaking point. But by the time Peter had made it to Leslie's house, Lee had gotten into Leslie's head. Leslie's entire tone on the situation had changed, and when Peter questioned the girls, they wouldn't admit to anything. Lee had gotten to them before Peter could, and I believe that he threatened them that if they revealed anything to Peter, they would pay for it. And Peter is really upset. He's dropped everything to be there for his sister, and now everyone is acting like nothing had even happened. And so Peter and Leslie kind of get into a bit of an argument, and during the argument, he asked, look, are you going to make Lee leave or what? And Leslie said no. And that was kind of the final straw for Peter. He couldn't bear to see Leslie allow Lee to continue living in this house, knowing what he is doing to the girls and just all the abuse in general. And so he told Leslie that she needed to start thinking of her children, and he stormed out. And that was sadly the last time Peter would ever talk to his sister. And so Peter goes home and he's just trying to decide what his next step should be. And he decided to call up Michael Tranter, the kid's biological father, who he hadn't spoken to in years.
Peter, my ex-brother-in-law, rang up and said Leslie's found him in my daughter's bedroom.
Michael has been spending the last several years searching for his ex-wife and his children because remember, the last thing he heard, Leslie and the 5 children had escaped Telford and they had basically went into hiding. Leslie had left Lee and, she had went into hiding with the kids. And now here it is 5 years later and he's finally hearing some news about his children. But this call would devastate Michael because Peter was calling to tell him about all of the abuse that had been going on in the house. And he's completely confused and shocked because he assumed that Leslie was still in hiding. He didn't even know that Leslie and Lee were back together. I think Peter was hoping that Michael, being the biological father, would be able to do something about this. And so Michael decided that he was going to reach out to his oldest daughter, Sarah Jane, and he finds out that she has a part-time job at McDonald's. And so he calls up McDonald's and he asks to speak to Sarah Jane. And after 5 long years of searching for his children, he finally hears the sound of his daughter's voice. He says, "Sarah, this is your real dad. I've been searching for you and your siblings, and I just want to make sure you're okay." I think that Michael was trying to establish a connection with Sarah Jane at first. Like, he couldn't just come in and try to grab her up and snatch her out of there. And I think that he was hoping this phone call would lead to another call and another, and then eventually they could meet in person. He needed to establish some trust, and I think that's probably what Michael was trying to accomplish here. He had not seen her since she was 12 years old, and who knows what Lee has filled her head with. And Sarah Jane actually sounded receptive. She seemed very calm and polite on the phone, but the call did not last very long. Sarah said that she needed to go and finish up her shift. Michael's assumption was that there would be another call in the future. However, when Sarah Jane got home from work that evening, she mentioned the call to her mom and Lee. And Lee was not happy. He didn't want anyone, but especially the man that he'd worked so hard to cut out of their lives, to be snooping around asking questions. So later on that evening, Michael gets another phone call out of the blue from someone he hadn't spoken to in years. This time it was from Leslie's mother. And Leslie's mother says, "I'm calling you to let you know that the kids are fine, they're safe, but they don't want to talk to you, they don't want to see you." And I know a lot of you are going to be wondering, A, why would Leslie's mom agree to make this phone call to keep Michael from trying to help the kids? And B, why is no one involving the police? And honestly, I am just as confused as you are. There is nothing in the research that explains either of these things. Maybe Leslie's mother truly believed that everything was okay. I'm sure that's what Leslie was telling her. Or did Lee's control extend to other family members, like Leslie's mother? Maybe Margaret was scared of Lee. Maybe he threatened her to make this call. Maybe Leslie begged her to make the call. I don't know. But Michael did not believe anything that Margaret said. He knew those kids were in danger. And so he decided that he was going to go down to Cornwall and do some investigating of his own. So he goes down there and he doesn't know really where to go. He doesn't have an address. And so he just kind of wanders around Cornwall searching for his children, but he didn't have any luck. And just a couple of months after Michael had that phone call with Sarah Jane, Leslie and her 4 oldest children vanished. They had last been seen at the end of August, and since then, Lee had been just going around telling anyone who would listen that Leslie had packed up the kids and left him again. And he went to great lengths to make the story believable. He gathered up the kids' school books and brought them down to the school, and he informed the school that the children would no longer be attending because they had moved off with their mother. He went down to McDonald's and told them that Sarah wouldn't be back, and he tried to get her last paycheck. He even bought some Christmas presents and asked one of his neighbors if he could store them at their house so his kids wouldn't find them. In the month that they were missing, Lee was so distraught that he contacted an old girlfriend and tried to hook up with her, and he told her the same sob story that Leslie had left him. But again, one person that Leslie always kept informed on her whereabouts was her mother. And when a month passed and she still hadn't heard from Leslie and the kids, she knew something was seriously wrong. And that's when Peter's uncle called to inform him that Leslie and the kids had been missing for about a month.
My uncle phoned me to say that, "Have I seen Leslie and the kids?" And I said, "No." "Why?" "Because she's gone missing."
He goes down to Telford to search for Leslie and the kids. He's calling anyone and everyone he can think of that might know where Leslie was, but no one had heard from her in months. And this is when Peter decided that it was time to call the police. And when he did call the police, he flat out told them, "I'm pretty sure my brother-in-law killed my sister and 4 of her children." The police launched an investigation immediately, and they started by going down to Lee and Leslie's house and questioning Lee. And they asked Lee, tell us everything you remember about the last day that you saw Leslie and the kids. His story was that he and Leslie had had a big fight about money, and she and the oldest kids had left with someone in a car, and that's all he knew. He hadn't seen or heard from them since. And with no evidence against Lee at this point, the police just have to take his statement and continue investigating. But they were pretty sure that Lee was involved. First of all, they could not find not one person anywhere who had seen or heard from Leslie after the end of August. There's also no activity on Leslie or the kids' cell phones. And this is chilling, but the last text message to one of the girls was a friend who was checking in on them, and she jokingly asked, "Are you still alive?" And on top of that, police are starting to hear about the years of extreme abuse and control that Lee had put the family through. So they're pretty convinced that Lee is involved. And so they start surveilling him just to keep track of his movements, make sure that, while they're gathering more information, he doesn't go on the run. And news of Leslie and the kids' disappearance is being blasted all over the television, all over the newspapers.
Officers had been alerted by Mrs. Ford's concerned brother. She was last seen in August, and her children hadn't attended school at all this term.
And this put a lot of pressure on Lee, and he suddenly disappeared from the area. Lee started to panic, and remember, he still has his and Leslie's 2 younger children with him. He was gone for 2 days, and it turns out that he was dropping his kids off at his parents' house in Telford. He also made a pit stop at Leslie's mother's house, where he dropped off a bunch of Leslie and the kids' things, and he told her, "You can give this stuff to Leslie when she finally decides to show up." Still desperately clinging to his story that Leslie was still alive and she had just run off somewhere. But deep down, Lee knew that the walls were closing in. It was only a matter of time before police caught up with him. Police set up a roadblock coming into Carnkai, and they finally caught Lee as he was coming back into the village. They initially arrested him on unrelated charges of welfare fraud because they just needed some reason to detain him and make sure that he wouldn't run again before they could bring more serious charges against him for the disappearances. At this point, they still don't have any definitive proof that Leslie and the kids didn't just run off. There's no crime scene, there's no physical evidence. They are just going off a hunch, a very strong hunch, but a hunch nonetheless. And so they take Lee down to the station and they have him in an interrogation room, and they are interviewing him.
Detectives had been quizzing Lee Ford at this police station, looking for clues as to what happened to the young mum and her teenage children.
Meanwhile, there is an entire crew doing a search of the house. And this is a race against the clock because they can only keep Lee in their custody for 24 hours. And so they are just hoping that they find something at that house that will lead them to the truth of the situation. But before they were able to find anything incriminating, Lee actually broke down and confessed. He told investigators that he had murdered Leslie and 4 of her children, and then he buried them under the woodshed. He knew it was just a matter of time before the search team discovered the bodies, and so he figured he might as well come clean. And what I'm about to tell you is Lee Ford's account of what happened that night in September of 2000. According to Lee, he and Leslie got into a big argument. He said that at some point he lost his cool and he hit Leslie in the head with a baseball bat. He then allegedly had some remorse for beating his wife with a baseball bat. And so he claims that he had her lie down, he gave her some tea, he gave her some pain medication, and then he walked out to the garage just to cool down. But instead of cooling down, he spotted a rope and he got the idea to kill her. He says he went back into the house, he put the rope around Leslie's neck, and he pulled until she was dead. But of course, he did not stop there. He now decides that all of Leslie's children need to die as well. So Lee remained very calm. The children, according to him, didn't even know that their mother was dead in the next room. And over the course of the next 24 hours, one by one, Lee called each of the kids into the kitchen. He would sneak up behind them, put the rope around their neck, and he would strangle them to death. He would have been hiding each body after he killed them, and then he would call the next child into the kitchen to do the same thing to them. According to Lee, none of the kids knew what was coming. None of them knew that their siblings or their mother was already dead. By the end of this killing spree, he had murdered 5 members of his family. Now, the way Lee explained it, he just snapped and killed everyone. He said he didn't even know why he did it. I do not believe that for 1 second. I don't even believe that there was an argument between Leslie and Lee in the first place. I think that this was a premeditated killing spree, and this plan was hatched because Lee knew everything was getting ready to crumble. People were starting to find out that he was sexually abusing his stepdaughter. Peter knew, Michael now knew, and it was later discovered that in the days leading up to the murders, Leslie had went down and spoken to a solicitor together, and she and Sarah Jane told them about the sexual abuse, and Leslie was trying to get a protective order for her and the children against Lee. And it's believed that Lee was not just abusing Sarah Jane, he was also abusing Anne Marie. So right before her death, Leslie had a moment of clarity, a moment of courage, and she had tried to get some help for her and her children. But nothing was done about it. They made this report, but no one came to question her or the kids about these allegations. Leslie had finally got up the courage to stand up to Lee, and his darkest secret was about to be revealed, and he could not let that happen. After he murdered Leslie and the kids, he dug a massive grave under the woodshed and he buried them there. So that entire month that they had been missing, their bodies had been right there on the property. Lee would have been seeing their graves every single day. He would have been walking past them. And that is where the bodies stayed until the police started looking into the case. Once the police got involved, once they came by the house to question Lee, he got panicked and he started moving the bodies to a different location a few miles away. He dug a shallow grave in a potato field about 6 miles away from his home, and he started reburying the bodies. However, by the time the police caught up to him, he had only managed to move 2 of the bodies. Sarah Jane and Anne Marie were found in the potato field, and Leslie and the 2 boys were discovered still buried in the woodshed. And police said that as they were approaching the woodshed, they could smell the stench of death right away. Lee showed no remorse during his confession, no emotion. Everything he said was very straightforward and matter of fact. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but Lee actually entered a plea of not guilty after literally confessing and leading police to the bodies. And so a trial date was set. But thankfully, on the morning that the trial was set to start, Lee changed his plea to guilty. It's thought that he did this because it started to dawn on him that if this case went to trial, so many disturbing details would come to light. Everyone would know that Lee had been sexually abusing his stepdaughters, and he did not want all of that to get out to the public. And in the end, Lee was sentenced to 5 life terms, 1 for each of the people that he murdered. But life didn't really mean life in this situation. In this case, 5 life terms actually meant 35 years until the possibility of parole, which is already a slap in the face. He had systematically murdered 5 innocent people, but he ended up appealing the sentence, and it was later reduced from 35 years down to 27 years, which means that Lee Ford will be eligible for parole in 2027. There is a pre-tariff review that could take place this year in 2025, and this is why I wanted to cover this case. Michael Tranter has started a petition to keep Lee Ford in prison for life where he belongs.
Lee Ford strangled the 4 children and their mother in the Cornish village of Carn Kai in the summer of 2000. The minimum on his life sentence was reduced to 27 years on appeal. That terrifies Michael, who has started a petition in a bid to get the sentence debated in Parliament.
I'm getting more anxious. Obviously, I'm not saying he would come out, but if he did, then there's other people about who would not be safe. This chap has took 5 lives and completely messed up a load of other people's lives. To me, life is life. He shouldn't come out.
The petition had over 30,000 signatures the last time I checked, but I am hoping that we can get Michael even more signatures, and I will leave a link to the petition in my description box. If you're like me and more than 30,000 others who think that 27 years isn't nearly long enough for taking the lives of 5 people, please go click that link and sign the petition. As of now, Lee Ford is currently serving his sentence at HMP Durham, and let's just hope that he stays there for the rest of his life. Lee and Leslie's 2 children were sent to live with their uncle, and I really hope that they are doing well today. And that is all I have on this case. Please let me know what you guys think about this one down in the comments. Don't forget to go to buyraycon.com/SummerSanchez to shop for Father's Day and get 15% off site-wide. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you to support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.